I didn't wake up one day and realize I had lost my life. That's not how it happens. You don't lose yourself loudly. There's no single mistake, no dramatic collapse, no moment you can point to and say, that's when it went wrong. What happens instead is quieter, almost polite. You adjust. You compromise. You choose the option that causes the least friction. And then you do it again. At first, those choices feel responsible. Mature. Thoughtful. You tell yourself that life isn't about doing exactly what you want, but about navigating reality. About being flexible. About understanding that not every desire deserves action. That sounds wise. It sounded wise to me too. I told myself I wasn't giving things up, just postponing them. That I wasn't abandoning parts of myself, just being realistic. That there would be time later to circle back to what I really wanted. Later became a habit. I started choosing what was easiest to explain instead of what felt most alive. If a decision could be justified logically, I took it, even if something inside me hesitated. If a path looked stable and sensible, I followed it, even if it felt strangely empty. I didn't argue with myself. I negotiated. This isn't the right moment. This isn't practical. This can wait. And because each compromise was small, it never felt like loss. It felt like adaptation. People praised me for it. They said I was grounded. Realistic. Someone who didn't chase fantasies or make reckless decisions. I liked that image. It made me feel safe, like I was doing adulthood correctly. What I didn't notice was how often I ignored a quiet inner resistance. A subtle feeling that something was being left behind each time I chose comfort over truth, clarity over curiosity, safety over alignment. I learned to override that feeling quickly. It was inconvenient. I told myself that inner conflict was just immaturity leaving my system. That eventually, wanting less would feel peaceful. It didn't. It felt numb. I became very good at living a life that didn't upset anyone, including myself. No sharp turns. No strong reactions. No obvious dissatisfaction. From the outside, everything looked fine. Inside, something was slowly dimming. I stopped feeling excited in the way I used to. Not disappointed, just neutral. I stopped feeling pulled toward things with intensity. Not because I didn't care, but because caring too much felt irresponsible. I trained myself to want gently. To want things that fit. To want things that wouldn't require disruption. And gradually, I stopped recognizing the difference between what I chose and what I settled for. That's when disappearance begins. Not when you lose everything, but when you stop noticing what you're losing. I still had goals. Still had plans. Still had a future in mind. But that future felt oddly generic, like it belonged to a version of me that existed mostly on paper. I was living a life that worked. I wasn't living a life that moved me. There were moments when I caught glimpses of what I had set aside. A memory. A thought. A sudden sense of longing that didn't fit neatly into my current reality. Those moments made me uncomfortable. So I dismissed them. That's not who you are anymore. You've moved on. That was unrealistic. Those phrases became my internal cleanup crew, quickly removing anything that threatened to disrupt the structure I had built. I told myself that everyone gives things up. That compromise is part of growing up. That no one lives exactly the life they imagined. All of that is true. But there's a difference between compromise and disappearance. I didn't see it yet. I only knew that my days felt smooth, predictable, manageable, and strangely distant. Like I was observing myself from slightly behind, always present but never fully inside the moment. I didn't feel miserable. That's why it took so long to notice. Misery demands attention. Absence doesn't. It just settles in quietly and waits. And one day, without warning, I had a thought that felt heavier than it should have. If nothing is technically wrong, why does my life feel like it belongs to someone else? That question didn't accuse me. It didn't panic me. It just stayed. And for the first time, I couldn't negotiate it away. Once that question settled in, why does my life feel like it belongs to someone else? I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. Not dramatic things. Ordinary ones. The way my days felt interchangeable. The way decisions no longer carried weight, only logic. The way I could explain my life perfectly but couldn't feel it in my body. I realized how rarely I felt pulled toward anything anymore. Not because I had found peace, but because I had learned to flatten desire before it grew inconvenient. Every time something inside me leaned forward, I leaned back. I evaluated it, categorized it, decided whether it was realistic, sustainable, justifiable. Most of the time, it failed that test. So I moved on. That process had become automatic. Efficient. Quiet. I began to see how often I chose neutrality. How often I stayed in the middle, avoided extremes, avoided commitment to anything that might require me to change. Change was risky. Not because it might go wrong, but because it might reveal that I had been living too cautiously for too long. I thought back to moments where I had almost chosen differently. Almost spoken honestly. Almost taken a risk. Almost followed something that didn't fit neatly into my existing life. Almost became my favorite word. Almost means you don't have to face consequences. Almost lets you feel brave without being exposed. Almost keeps the door open without ever walking through it. I had lived on almost for years. I realized then that my life wasn't empty, it was carefully contained. Designed to minimize regret, disappointment, and failure. Designed to be explainable. Explainable lives are safe. They are also forgettable. I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a placeholder. Like someone who had stepped into a role temporarily and forgotten to step out. I noticed how often I used the phrase, "this is fine," not as reassurance, but as resignation. Fine meant functional. Acceptable. Adequate. It never meant alive. I saw how often I adjusted my expectations downward instead of adjusting my life upward. How often I told myself I didn't really want certain things instead of admitting that I was afraid to pursue them. Fear had disguised itself as maturity. And maturity had become my hiding place. I realized that no one had forced this life on me. No one had silenced me or boxed me in. Every compromise had been voluntary, chosen because it felt safer than uncertainty. That realization was uncomfortable. Because it meant there was no villain to blame. Just a series of quiet decisions that all leaned in the same direction. Away from myself. I started feeling a strange kind of grief, not for a specific loss, but for accumulated absence. For all the versions of me that had been dismissed before they had a chance to exist. For all the feelings I had managed instead of lived. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of carrying a life that didn't resist me, but didn't respond to me either. I thought about how much energy it takes to maintain neutrality. To constantly adjust your inner volume. To keep your life from tipping in any direction that might demand courage. I realized I had confused comfort with peace. Comfort keeps things unchanged. Peace allows movement. I had chosen comfort every time. And now, comfort felt suffocating. There were moments when I considered changing everything, leaving, starting over, doing something drastic just to feel something again. But even that impulse felt performative, like another fantasy I could indulge without acting on. I didn't need a new life. I needed to stop disappearing inside the one I had. That's when I understood something important. Disappearance isn't about leaving. It's about staying while slowly removing yourself from the center of your own experience. I had been present for my life in the same way you're present in a waiting room. You're there, but you're not settled. You're passing time until something else begins. But nothing else was beginning. This was it. And once that became clear, the distance I felt toward my life stopped being abstract. It felt personal. I wasn't watching someone else live. I was watching myself refuse to step fully in. That realization didn't give me answers. But it made one thing impossible to ignore: if I continued choosing the quiet path out of myself, there would eventually be nothing left to return to. I didn't reclaim my life in a single moment. There was no dramatic reversal, no sudden courage that washed everything clean. I didn't wake up one morning feeling ready to finally be myself. That kind of transformation belongs to stories that end too quickly. What happened was slower. Heavier. I reached a point where disappearing no longer felt neutral. It started to feel like a choice. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every time I softened a decision to avoid discomfort, I felt it. Every time I chose the quieter path when something inside me leaned forward, I noticed the weight of that retreat. Compromise stopped feeling mature and started feeling expensive. Not immediately, but cumulatively. I realized I had been living as if intensity were dangerous. As if caring too much would destabilize everything I had built. I had designed my life to be manageable, not meaningful. Manageable lives don't demand much from you. They also don't give much back. I began to understand that nothing external was missing. There was no secret opportunity one had overlooked, no hidden passion waiting to be discovered. The absence I felt wasn't caused by lack of options. It was caused by lack of presence. I had been choosing not to inhabit my own life fully because inhabiting it meant risk, emotional risk, relational risk, the risk of discovering that I wanted something that didn't fit the structure I had built. So I had opted for a quieter form of safety. One where nothing was terribly wrong. And nothing was deeply right. The turning point wasn't rebellion. It was honesty. I stopped pretending that neutrality was enough. I stopped telling myself that numbness was peace. I stopped framing my withdrawal as wisdom. That didn't make me brave. It made me exposed. I began making small, almost invisible choices differently. Not loud ones. Not ones that required explanations. Just choices that moved me slightly closer to myself instead of slightly away. I let myself feel things longer, even when they were uncomfortable. I stayed with reactions instead of editing them out. I allowed dissatisfaction to exist without immediately neutralizing it. That felt unsafe. Not because something bad happened, but because I was no longer disappearing to protect myself. I realized how often I had used compromise as anesthesia. How efficiently I had dulled my own responses so life wouldn't ask too much of me. Letting those responses return felt like waking up a limb that had been asleep for too long. There was pain in it. And relief. I grieved what I had lost. Not in a dramatic way, quietly, privately. I grieved the years I had spent choosing explainable paths over honest ones. I grieved the parts of myself that had been slowly trained into silence. I grieved the time I would never get back. But grief wasn't the end. It was the beginning of presence. I learned something difficult: you don't disappear all at once, and you don't come back all at once either. You return in fragments. In moments of attention. In decisions that don't make perfect sense but feel aligned. I didn't become fearless. I became unwilling to keep leaving myself behind. That distinction matters. Fear didn't vanish. Doubt didn't vanish. The urge to choose the easiest explanation didn't vanish. What changed was my relationship to those impulses. I stopped letting them make my decisions for me. I allowed my life to feel uneven. Less smooth. Less controlled. I allowed myself to want things without knowing where they would lead. I allowed myself to feel disappointment without immediately turning it into acceptance. That didn't make my life better in obvious ways. It made it heavier. And real. For the first time, my days had texture again. Not just functionality. Not just routine. Moments lingered. Choices mattered. Even mistakes felt like participation instead of failure. I understood then that disappearing had never been about fear of failure. It had been about fear of presence. Presence requires you to feel your life as it happens, not after it's been filtered, adjusted, justified. I had avoided that for years. If you're listening to this and something in you recognizes the quiet path I've described, the careful life, the reasonable life, the one built on small compromises that don't hurt individually but hollow you out over time, I want you to hear this without accusation. You didn't disappear because you were weak. You disappeared because it felt safer than standing fully inside your own experience. But safety has a cost. And one day, you feel it. Not as panic. As distance. I didn't reclaim some grand destiny. I reclaimed something smaller, and more difficult. My attention. My presence. My willingness to feel my own life, even when it doesn't resolve neatly. I stopped choosing the quiet path out of myself. Not because I suddenly knew where I was going, but because I finally understood where I had been leaving. And once I saw that, staying, imperfect, uncertain, fully here, became the only choice that felt honest. That's how I stopped disappearing. Not by becoming someone else, but by no longer stepping away from the center of my own life.